Welcome to She Seeks Justice. I'm LaDonna Humphrey. There's a common misconception about unsolved murders that has always bothered me. People often imagine that a cold case is exactly what its name implies cold. They picture a dusty banker's box sitting on a forgotten shelf inside a police department, its contents untouched for years, while detectives move on to newer investigations and grieving families slowly learning to live with unanswered questions. It is an understandable image, but it is also one of the greatest myths surrounding violent crime. A case file may sit quietly inside a cabinet, but the people connected to that file never stop carrying it. Parents still wake up every morning wondering what happened to their child. Brothers and sisters still celebrate birthdays with an empty chair at the table, and detectives who spent years chasing one suspect after another never completely let go of the victims whose faces still visit them in quiet moments. Justice, I've learned, never really closes the file. It simply waits for someone willing to open it again. And when I wrote the book, The Girl I Never Knew, I believed I was telling the story of one remarkable young woman whose life ended far too soon. I wanted readers to know Melissa Witt as more than a headline or an unsolved murder. I wanted them to meet the daughter who adored her mother, the college student planning for her future, the young woman whose kindness left an impression on nearly everyone fortunate enough to know her. I also wanted people to understand the extraordinary work of the investigators who refused to abandon her case and the painful reality that justice delayed leaves scars reaching far beyond a single victim. When I finished writing the book, I believed I had honored Melissa's story as faithfully as I could. I never imagined that publishing it would become the beginning of an entirely different journey. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I had experienced in my career. My phone began ringing with calls from families whose loved ones had also disappeared or been murdered. Detectives reached out to me to compare notes, ask questions, and sometimes simply to talk with someone who understood the emotional weight of carrying an unsolved case. Emails arrived from complete strangers who had lived for decades with secrets they had never shared publicly. Some messages contained information that ultimately led nowhere. Others pointed toward forgotten witnesses, overlooked reports, or connections that deserved another look. Every conversation reminded me that Melissa's story had become something much larger than a single investigation. Her case had opened the door to an entire community of people searching for answers, and many of them had been searching alone. That realization changed the way I viewed my work. Up until then, I had thought of investigations as individual stories, with a beginning, a middle, and hopefully an ending. Instead, I discovered that justice has a way of weaving lives together in unexpected ways. One family introduces you to another. One detective recommends someone you should meet. One missing woman's story overlaps with another investigation hundreds of miles away. And before long, the map of victims, suspects, witnesses, investigators, and advocates becomes interconnected in ways that are impossible to ignore. What began as an effort to understand one unsolved murder gradually became a commitment to pursue justice wherever those paths might lead. And that is exactly why She Seeks Justice exists. This podcast is not an extension of The Girl I Never Knew, nor is it an audio version of the books I have written. Those stories have already been told. Instead, this is where we continue the work that books cannot always capture. Investigations evolve, new witnesses come forward, advances in forensic science change what is possible, and detectives retire while younger investigators inherit decades of work. Families continue searching, hoping that tomorrow will finally bring the phone call that they have prayed for. Justice is not frozen in time simply because a case grows old, and neither are the people who continue fighting for it. Over the years, people have occasionally asked whether I become discouraged, and the honest answer is yes. There are days when a promising lead for Melissa falls apart, when another witness passes away before investigators can speak with them, or when new evidence raises more questions than it answers. There are moments when the emotional weight of these stories feel overwhelming, particularly after spending time with parents who have waited decades for answers that never came. Yet I have also witnessed remarkable moments of hope. I have watched detectives refuse to give up after retirement because they could not forget a victim. I have seen communities rally around families who once believed they had been forgotten. I have learned that persistence has power all on its own, because every unanswered question kept alive is another opportunity for the truth to surface. And so this podcast, She Seeks Justice, it reflects more than my own work. It represents every mother who refuses to stop looking for her child, every sister who keeps sharing a missing person's photograph year after year, every detective who carries an old case home in the back of his mind, and every advocate willing to stand beside families when the headlines have faded. Justice belongs to all of them. My role is simply to help tell their stories with honesty and to continue asking the questions that still deserve answers. And after 2 decades that I've spent working on missing persons and unsolved murders, people still ask me one question more than any other, and that is, which case has changed your life? And there have been many cases that have left an imprint on my heart. I've met extraordinary families whose courage has humbled me, and I've investigated crimes that still keep me awake at night. Every victim matters. Every family deserves answers. But if I'm being truthful, there is one case that forever altered the direction of my life and ultimately led me to where I am today. And her name was Melissa Witt. I never met Melissa, we never had a conversation, and I never had the opportunity to tell her what an impact her story would someday have on my life. By every ordinary definition, she was a stranger. And yet somehow, over the years, she became one of the people I have come to know best. I know the dreams she wrote about in her diary. I know the places she loved. I know the detectives who refused to stop searching for her killer. I've stood in the place where investigators believe she spent the final moments of her life. And I've spent countless hours trying to understand the man who took her future away. When I began investigating Melissa's murder, I thought I was only making a documentary. That was the plan. I would spend several months researching the case, interview the people who had been there from the beginning, tell Melissa's story, and then move on to the next project. But looking back now, I almost laugh at how naive that sounds. I had no idea that I was stepping into a journey that would consume years of my life and introduce me to detectives, witnesses, victims' families, investigators, and trolls across the country. Melissa's story became the doorway to something much larger than I could ever imagine. But before we go any further, I think it's important that you know, the listener know, who Melissa was. Because somewhere along the way, our society developed a habit of introducing victims by describing how they died instead of how they lived. We remember the crime but forget the person. I never want to make that mistake. Before we talk about an abduction, a murder investigation, or a cold case that has remained unsolved for decades, I want to meet the young woman whose life was stolen on December 1st, 1994. Melissa Witt was 19 years old. She was attending Ozark Community College, working as a dental assistant and planning for a future that seemed wide open. Her friends described her as kind and funny and genuinely joyful. She loved her mother deeply, and the two shared a relationship that many people envied. She wasn't living a reckless life. She wasn't surrounded by chaos. She was doing exactly what thousands of young women across America do every single day. She was going to school, working hard, spending time with family and friends, and dreaming about what came next. On the evening of December 1st, 1994, Melissa left work and headed toward Bowling World in Fort Smith, Arkansas, where her mother was participating in league bowling. But she never made it through the front doors. And when I first started working Melissa's case, I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to begin by looking for a killer. I was going to begin by understanding the victim. And too often we rush straight to suspects, theories, and speculation, without taking the time to understand the person whose life was taken. I have always believed that if you truly understand the victim, you often begin to understand the crime. And Melissa wasn't living a secret double life. Over the years, I've heard nearly every rumor imaginable about her. I've listened to podcasters botch the story, or make up details, or put on witnesses and guests that really have nothing to contribute to the story. And I've watched those rumors grow more elaborate with each passing decade. And that's one of the unfortunate realities of cold cases, I think. When answers are missing, people often fill the void with speculation. Before long, speculation becomes rumor, and rumor becomes accepted as fact. And one of my responsibilities throughout this investigation had been separating truth from fiction. And the truth is that Melissa was a 19-year-old college student who worked as a dental assistant and remained incredibly close to her mother, Mary Ann. She had plans for her future. She had responsibilities. She had friends who loved her and coworkers who respected her. There was nothing about her daily life that suggested that she was headed toward danger, and that Thursday began like so many others. Melissa attended school, she went to work, and prepared to meet her mother later that evening at Bowling World in Fort Smith. Along the way, she experienced something almost everyone has experienced at one time or another. Her car battery died. A good Samaritan helped jumpstart her vehicle, and Melissa continued with her plans. It was an ordinary inconvenience on what appeared to be an ordinary day. She drove home, she changed clothes, and then she left for Bowling World. But she never walked through that front door. What happened in the next few minutes has been the focus of investigators for nearly 3 decades. We know some things with certainty. We know Melissa parked in the northwest corner of the parking lot. We know witnesses later reported hearing a woman scream for help. We know her car keys were eventually found on the pavement, and investigators later discovered blood drops on those keys. We know Melissa vanished from a parking lot filled with people, yet no one saw enough to know what was unfolding. That sequence of events has always fascinated me because it tells us something important about whoever attacked her. This wasn't a random encounter that unfolded over several hours. Everything happened quickly. The person responsible acted decisively enough to abduct a 19-year-old woman from a public parking lot without drawing enough attention to stop him. That's a bold crime. It's risky. The possibility that she knew her killer has baffled me for years, and I think it changes the emotional weight of the entire case. A stranger abduction is terrifying because it suggests random evil. But the possibility that Melissa knew her killer suggests something even more disturbing. It suggests that in the final moments before violence erupted, she may have been looking at the face of someone familiar. And there are several reasons investigators have considered that possibility. The first is the location of Melissa's disappearance. She was not taken from a dark alley, an isolated highway, or a remote stretch of road. She vanished from a parking lot, a place where her mother was inside bowling on a league, and where Melissa had reason to feel safe. She had driven there voluntarily, many times. She parked her car, and she was apparently close enough to the entrance that she could have been able to walk inside within minutes. For someone to intercept her there, control the situation quickly, and get her away without creating enough chaos to stop the abduction suggests either tremendous boldness or some degree of familiarity. That does not prove Melissa knew him, of course, and I want to be careful here because responsible advocacy requires discipline. But it does raise a fair investigative question. Would Melissa have stopped willingly if a stranger approached her in the parking lot? Would she have paused long enough for a conversation or an argument? Would she have allowed someone close enough to overpower her? Or did the encounter begin because she recognized him, trusted him, or at least felt safe, and felt like she had no immediate reason to fear him? Those questions matter because the first moments of an abduction often reveal something important about the offender. The evidence left behind in the parking lot also points to a sudden and violent confrontation. Melissa's keys were found at Bowling World, and investigators later discovered blood on them. Her car remained in the parking lot. She did not simply leave with someone and forget to return. Something happened there, and it happened fast. Witnesses reported hearing a woman scream for help, which suggests the encounter escalated quickly once Melissa realized she was in danger. If she knew the person who approached her, then the shift from recognition to terror may have happened in just a matter of seconds. And then there is the location where her body was eventually found. Melissa was discovered 45 days later in the Ozark National Forest, in an area so remote that investigators believe her killer was familiar with it. Her body was found off of Forest Service Road 1551 near a large rock in a place that would have been difficult for a person to locate by accident. That detail has always mattered to me, because whoever took Melissa from Fort Smith and drove her deep into the Ozark National Forest either knew exactly where he was going or had enough experience in that area to move through it with confidence. That suggests a particular kind of offender. He may have been a local. He may have hunted, fished, camped, logged, or spent time in that part of the forest. He may have known the back roads well enough to understand where he could go without being seen. And investigators have long considered the possibility that Melissa's killer was someone connected to the river valley or someone who frequented the Ozark National Forest. The forest was not merely where her body was hidden. Based on debris found in her airway, investigators believe she was killed near the location where she was discovered. That means the killer did not just dispose of her there. He brought her there alive. And I'm sorry, but that's a chilling distinction. The items that were missing from Melissa are another part of that question that bothers me. Her clothing, purse, wallet, and one gold hoop earring, along with her Mickey Mouse watch, were never recovered. Investigators have discussed the possibility that the killer kept the watch as a memento or trophy, something that allowed him to relive the crime. If that is true, it suggests the watch meant something to him beyond its monetary value. A stranger could keep an item as a trophy, certainly, but if Melissa knew her killer, that watch may have represented something more personal and more disturbing. Retired Detective Chris Boyd's theory has always stayed with me because it gives shape to the possibility that Melissa knew the person who killed her. He believed her killer may have known where she would be that night and may have been waiting for her at Bowling World. In that theory, the parking lot confrontation was not necessarily a carefully planned murder from the beginning, but rather an encounter that spiraled into violence when something went wrong. Maybe Melissa rejected him. Maybe she argued. Maybe she tried to walk away. But whatever happened, the evidence suggests the situation erupted quickly, and once it did, her killer made a series of choices that ended in the Ozark National Forest. And that theory also fits with the emotional violence of the crime. Strangulation is intimate. It requires proximity. It requires sustained force. It often reflects rage, control, or a deeply personal need to dominate the victim. When investigators and advocates look at a case like Melissa's, they are not only looking at geography, timelines, and physical evidence. They are also looking at behavior. Behavior can reveal what the offender wanted, how much control he had, and whether the crime appears random, planned, impulsive, personal, or some combination of all of those things combined. The hardest part for me is knowing that if Melissa did in fact know him, his name was spoken in ordinary conversations right before she disappeared. It may have been written somewhere in her diary, remembered by a friend, mentioned casually to a coworker, or tucked into a detail that seemed meaningless at the time. That's what makes this case and this question so haunting. If Melissa knew her killer, then the answer may not be buried in some distant mystery. It may be hiding in plain sight, somewhere inside the ordinary details of her life. And that brings us to the question that still sits at the center of this case. Did Melissa Witt know the man who killed her? In my next episode, I'm going to take a much deeper look at the evidence surrounding Melissa's disappearance. I'm going to examine what investigators discovered in the Bowling World parking lot. I'm going to explore why they believe the confrontation unfolded the way it did. And I'm going to introduce you to the retired detectives who have devoted decades of their lives to seeking justice for Melissa Witt. We'll also begin examining the early theories that shaped this investigation and discuss why some of those theories have endured while others have completely fallen apart. If you're searching for quick answers, I'm going to be honest with you. This isn't that kind of a story. Real investigations are complicated, justice is rarely simple, and it almost never arrives on our timetable. But if you're willing to follow the evidence, challenge assumptions, and walk beside me through one of Arkansas's most haunting unsolved murders, I promise you this journey will be worth taking. Thank you for joining me for this episode of She Seeks Justice. If this story moved you, I hope you'll subscribe, follow the podcast on YouTube, and share it with someone who believes, as I do, that victims deserve more than to become forgotten headlines. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be spoken about with dignity, and above all, they deserve justice. So until next time, I'm LaDonna Humphrey, and this has been She Seeks Justice, where every victim has a story, every family deserves answers, and every case reminds us that the pursuit of justice never truly ends, because this investigation into the murder of Melissa Witt is only just beginning.